Sometimes, the biggest battles of our lives aren't fought on grand stages or in headlines. They're fought in our own neighborhoods. They come not in the form of enemies from far away, but in the face of a neighbor who believes control matters more than community. I remember the day I made the decision to leave the HOA. It wasn't rebellion for the sake of rebellion. It was a choice for freedom, for fairness, and for the simple right to live without being crushed under rules that didn't build unity but division. But the moment I stepped away, James, a man who had long confused power with purpose, picked up his phone and called the police. He thought his voice carried the authority to strip me of my dignity. He thought the weight of a system designed to intimidate would silence me. What he didn't expect was that the officer walking up that driveway was my own brother, a man who wore his badge not for ego, but for justice, for service, for the belief that ordinary people deserve extraordinary protection. That moment was not about revenge. It was about truth. It was about watching arrogance collapse under the weight of integrity. James wasn't humiliated because my brother wore a uniform. He was humbled because, for once, he saw that community stands taller than control, that justice belongs not to the powerful but to the people. And here's what I want you to take away. This is not just about an HOA, or one man named James, or a badge that carried authority. This is about us, about every ordinary person who refuses to be bent by unfairness, who stands tall in the face of pressure, who remembers that perseverance isn't loud but it is unbreakable. Across this country, and across every neighborhood, people are quietly fighting battles like these. Parents raising children in homes that aren't perfect but are filled with love. Workers showing up every day to jobs that may not honor them, yet they push forward anyway. Neighbors choosing kindness when bitterness would be easier. These are the extraordinary acts that build a future worth believing in. So let this story remind you are not powerless. Change begins not with grand speeches or sweeping laws, but with the courage to stand your ground when it matters most. With the humility to work for something greater than yourself. With the belief that no matter how small your fight may seem, it has the power to echo into something larger. And when arrogance rises, when control tries to disguise itself as leadership, remember this: justice, unity, and perseverance will always outlast intimidation. My friends, let's not just be people who endure rules we know are broken. Let us be the ones who rebuild trust where it's been lost, who defend dignity where it's been attacked, and who believe that freedom is not granted by a board or a badge. It's lived together as neighbors, as families, as one community. Because in the end, James didn't just lose. We all gained. We gained the reminder that courage belongs to the everyday. That perseverance still matters. And that hope grounded in responsibility, in unity, and in action, will always light the way forward. There are moments in life when silence feels heavier than words. Moments when the weight of small, ordinary decisions suddenly carries the gravity of history. For me, one of those moments came on a quiet morning, the sun not yet high enough to burn away the fog that clung to my street. That was the day I walked away from the HOA. At first glance, it may sound like nothing more than paperwork, nothing more than a resignation from a neighborhood association that prides itself on order and rules. But let me tell you, this was not about paper. This was about principle. It was about the kind of freedom you only recognize after you've felt it being taken away. One rule, one fine, one threat at a time. The signs had been building for months. Every time I stepped outside my front door, I felt eyes watching. Every time I placed a chair on my porch, a letter would appear in my mailbox. Every time I planted flowers in the soil my hands had worked, someone would measure, count, and report. These weren't just rules. They were chains, disguised as guidelines, meant to hold people in place while convincing them it was for their own good. I began to notice what these rules did to people around me. Neighbors who once smiled when they passed each other on evening walks now avoided eye contact, afraid that even conversation might be seen as conspiracy. Families who once gathered on weekends behind grills and laughter now huddled quietly, blinds drawn, fearful that a single noise complaint could bring down a storm. A community that once felt alive began to feel like a cage. And so, one day, I stood in my living room, the letter of resignation in my hand, the HOA handbook on the table beside me. My heart was pounding, not because I didn't know what I had to do, but because I knew exactly what it meant once I did it. It meant stepping outside the safety of silence. It meant refusing to bow to a system that mistook fear for order. It meant telling James, the man who had long confused control with leadership, that I would not be intimidated into compliance. But here's what they don't tell you about moments like this: they don't come with applause. They don't come with headlines. They come in the stillness of your own home, when you look yourself in the mirror and ask, do I have the courage to walk away? Do I have the strength to endure what will follow? As I sealed the envelope, I could almost hear the neighborhood itself holding its breath. The streets outside seemed quieter, as if the pavement knew what was about to happen. The walls seemed to echo with memories of those who had whispered about leaving but never dared. In that silence, I realized something: this wasn't just about me. It was about every person who had ever been told to sit down when they wanted to stand, every family who had ever been fined for the simple act of living, every neighbor who had ever wondered if freedom was too expensive to afford. The walk to the mailbox was only a few steps, but every footfall felt heavier than the last. My hand trembled as I pulled open the metal door, as though the entire weight of the neighborhood rested on whether I let go of that letter. For a brief second, I hesitated. Not because I doubted my choice, but because I understood what would follow. This wasn't just withdrawal, it was defiance. It was the spark of a storm. When the envelope slid into the darkness of that box, I knew life would not be the same. Something irreversible had begun. Somewhere behind another door, James was waiting for the chance to remind me that no one walks away without consequence. Somewhere, beyond that quiet street, forces bigger than my resignation were shifting. And as I turned back toward my home, the air felt different. Lighter, yet charged, as though the sky itself had decided to withhold its judgment, waiting to see what would come next. Because when you take a step like that, you don't just change your own story. You change the story of everyone watching. The moment I dropped that letter into the mailbox, I knew silence wouldn't last. The kind of silence I felt wasn't peace. It was the calm before a storm, the pause between lightning and thunder. And when storms arrive, they always reveal who people truly are. James had always been a man of order, or so he claimed. He wore authority like a uniform, though no badge had ever been pinned to his chest. To him, the HOA wasn't just a board. It was a kingdom, and he was determined to rule it. His rules weren't written in ink. They were carved in stone, wielded with the weight of intimidation and fines that cut deeper than they should have. For months, I'd seen it. The way neighbors would lower their voices when he walked past, the way families would quickly tuck away their bicycles or pull down their decorations before his inspections came around. James didn't just enforce rules. He lived to remind people that he could. And now, in his mind, I had committed the greatest offense of all. I had dared to leave his grasp. I remember the day he made his move. The sun was high, the air heavy, with that kind of summer stillness that makes every sound sharper. I was trimming the hedges in my yard when I saw him. James didn't walk, he prowled. Slow, deliberate, his polished shoes tapping against the pavement like a metronome of authority. His eyes locked on me, carrying that smug certainty of a man who believes he cannot be challenged. He stopped at the edge of my driveway, his shadow stretching across my lawn like a warning. With a folded piece of paper in his hand, he called my name. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The kind of tone that wasn't meant for me alone, but for every window and curtain twitching in the houses nearby. James wanted witnesses. He wanted this moment etched into the memory of the neighborhood. You can't just walk away, he said, his words sharp, almost rehearsed. Membership isn't optional. You signed the covenant. You're bound to it. I stood there, clippers in hand, sweat stinging my brow, the hum of the cicadas filling the silence between us. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't have words, but because I knew he was waiting for them. Men like James feed on resistance. It gives them more fuel to push harder. So instead, I let the silence hang, and in that silence I saw something flicker across his face. No doubt. No, James never doubted himself, but calculation. The kind of mental arithmetic a man does when he realizes intimidation alone might not be enough this time. That's when he unfolded the paper in his hand. It was an official notice, stamped with the seal of the HOA. But more than the ink, it was the threat beneath the words that carried the weight. He wasn't just warning me of fines or penalties. He was preparing the ground for something bigger, something heavier, something that would go beyond the boundaries of neighborhood disputes. "You're forcing my hand," he said, holding the notice out like a summons. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to escalate this." And there it was, the move, the escalation. The signal that this would not remain a quiet disagreement between two men on opposite sides of a street. James wasn't just trying to hold me accountable to his rules. He was preparing to drag the weight of the law into a battle that should never have needed it. As I looked at the paper, my mind raced. Not with fear, but with awareness. This wasn't about grass heights or mailbox colors anymore. This was about control, about power dressed up as procedure. James believed that with one phone call, with one report, he could bend me back into the system I had just escaped. And as he turned, sliding the notice into my hand, with a cold satisfaction, I could feel the air shift around us. Neighbors who had been pretending not to watch were peeking through blinds, their faces pale with the recognition of what was unfolding. They knew James. They knew how far he was willing to go. And now, they were seeing it play out in real time. I folded the paper, slid it into my pocket, and nodded without a word, because in that moment, I understood James wasn't bluffing. He was ready to call in reinforcements. He was ready to test how far intimidation could reach. He was ready to use fear as his greatest weapon. What James didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the very weapon he thought would break me was about to be the one that shattered him. It began with the shrill sound of a phone ringing. A sound so ordinary, yet on that day, it carried a weight I could feel in my chest. It was the kind of sound that doesn't just interrupt silence, it slices through it, demanding attention. And though I couldn't hear the words on the other end, I knew instinctively that this was the moment everything would shift. James had warned me. His threats weren't empty, though at first they sounded like theater. He told me he would escalate. He told me he would make a call. And now, standing inside his living room, behind closed blinds, he was doing exactly that. Neighbors later described it the same way, his hand gripping the receiver like a lifeline, his jaw set with the certainty of a man who believed he was in control. But it wasn't control he held in that moment. It was a spark capable of igniting something much larger than he had bargained for. I stood by my window as I watched him. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. I could see it in the way he paced, the way his free hand chopped the air with each sentence. His voice rose, muffled through the glass, but sharp enough that the tone alone carried the message he wasn't asking for help. He was demanding it. And that was when the weight of his choice began to dawn on me. This was no longer a dispute about lawn height or mailbox paint. James wasn't calling a neighbor or another board member. He was reaching for the full force of law, reaching for authority greater than his own, hoping to bend it to his will. What he didn't realize was that every call leaves an echo. Every demand sets in motion a chain of events that cannot be controlled once it begins. And as his words carried through the line, an operator typed them into a report, dispatching them into the system, setting wheels in motion that neither James nor I could stop. I remember gripping the edge of my kitchen counter, my knuckles white, as if bracing myself for the inevitable knock on my door. Would it come that day? That hour? Or would they arrive under the cover of night, when the neighborhood was sleeping, when shadows would make it easier to disguise the weight of what was happening? But it wasn't just fear that settled over me. It was something deeper, heavier. A realization. James believed he was calling reinforcements against one man. What he didn't understand was that his call was summoning something larger. He was about to awaken truths about power, about justice, and about the difference between enforcing rules and abusing them. Every ring of his phone seemed to ripple across the street. Curtains shifted. Eyes peered out from behind glass. No one could hear the words, but everyone could feel the tension. It wasn't just my battle anymore. It had become the neighborhood's theater, and each person watching was silently asking the same question: what happens when authority collides with arrogance? When James finally hung up, his face bore a look I'll never forget. It wasn't relief. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something closer to triumph, the smug smile of a man who believed the game was already over. He turned, looked across the street in my direction, and for a brief moment our eyes met. His stare wasn't casual. It was a warning, a promise of what was coming. I didn't flinch. But inside, I could feel the ground shifting beneath me. Because when a man like James calls for force, he doesn't just summon an officer. He summons the test of whether justice can be bent by pressure, whether power can be hijacked for personal gain, whether one voice on a line can tip the balance of right and wrong. I walked back into my living room, each step heavy with anticipation. I could almost hear the wheels of the squad car turning, the faint crackle of a radio somewhere in the distance, the approaching storm that was now inevitable. This was no longer a question of if they would come, only when. And as the minutes stretched into hours, every sound outside became a question. Every car door, every bark of a dog, every faint siren carried with it the possibility that the moment had arrived. Somewhere between the silence of waiting and the tension of knowing, I realized something had already shifted forever. Because when James picked up that phone, he thought he was securing control. He thought he was tightening his grip on the neighborhood. What he didn't know was that the call he made would not only summon law enforcement to my door, it would summon a truth he could never control, and it would summon a reckoning he would never be able to escape. There are sounds you never forget. Some are gentle, the ladder of a child, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Others are sharp, a shattering glass, a sudden alarm. But there is one sound that carries a weight unlike any other, the knock at a door when you know it is not a neighbor bringing kindness, but authority bringing judgment. That evening, the air outside was heavy. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving the neighborhood cloaked in a gray stillness. Inside my home, every clock seemed louder than usual, every creak in the floorboards stretched out like an omen. I had been waiting, ever since James hung up that phone, for this very moment. And when it finally came, 3 deliberate knocks, each one spaced with precision, it was not a surprise. It was an inevitability. I froze in place for a second, the sound reverberating through the walls. It wasn't frantic or casual. It was measured, firm. The kind of knock meant to remind you that you were not in control anymore. The kind of knock that didn't ask for permission to be heard. It demanded it. Through the blinds, I saw the faint flicker of red and blue lights washing over the houses across the street. My chest tightened. The neighbors who had been peeking from behind curtains earlier in the day were back at their windows now, their silhouettes framed by pale lampshade glows. They knew what this was. They knew the escalation had reached its peak. The knocks came again, sharper this time, and with them came the silence of an entire neighborhood holding its breath. Children were pulled back from windows, dogs hushed with hurried hands, conversations cut off mid-sentence. It wasn't just my door being knocked on. It was the collective door of every family that had ever wondered if freedom in their own home was fragile, if it could be stripped away with the rap of a knuckle against wood. I took a step toward the door. My heartbeat was a drum in my chest, steady yet relentless. Each footfall on the hardwood floor seemed to echo louder than the last. My hand reached out, hovering over the handle, trembling not from fear, but from the magnitude of the moment. On the other side of that door was not just an officer. On the other side was the weight of James's call, the reach of his ambition, the embodiment of his belief that control could silence defiance. And as I stood there, inches away from turning that handle, I thought about what this knock meant. It meant James had succeeded in dragging authority into his personal crusade. It meant I was no longer just a man who had left the HOA. I was now marked as a dissenter, a target. It meant the battle had shifted from notices and warnings to confrontation. The knocks came a third time, louder than before, each strike against the wood reverberating through my ribs like a challenge. Whoever was on the other side was no longer waiting patiently. They were announcing presence, asserting dominance, demanding response. I pressed my palm against the door, feeling the vibrations of that final knock still humming against the surface. My eyes closed for a moment, and I thought of my brother. The man who wore a badge not for ego, but for service. I thought of how different his knock would sound, respectful, cautious, measured with empathy. And I wondered, who is on the other side of this door? Whose values will meet mine when I open it? Outside, I could hear the faint shuffle of boots on gravel, the crackle of a radio, the low murmur of voices. Shadows stretched across my porch, figures moving with trained precision. This wasn't a neighborly visit. This wasn't a conversation. This was enforcement. This was escalation given flesh and bone. And still, I hesitated. Because opening that door wasn't just about greeting whoever stood there. It was about stepping into the next chapter of a battle I hadn't chosen, but could no longer avoid. It was about facing the embodiment of James's decision to turn a disagreement into a war. The handle was cool beneath my fingers as I finally wrapped my hand around it. The air seemed thicker now, as though the entire neighborhood was pressing in around me, waiting for the creak of hinges, the reveal of uniforms, the clash of authority and defiance. I took a breath, steady but sharp, the kind of breath you take before stepping onto a stage, before facing a jury, before crossing a threshold you cannot return from. Because when that door opened, it would not just be me standing there. It would be every neighbor who had watched in silence, every family who had felt powerless, every voice that had been hushed by fear. And with the twist of that handle, I knew the world on the other side of the door would never look the same again. When the door finally opened, time seemed to slow. The porch light spilled across the uniforms standing before me, the shine of metal badges glinting against the dusk. Their presence filled the night like a wall. Authority embodied in flesh, silence sharpened into command. But in that sea of shadows and steel, my eyes caught one face. A face I knew better than my own reflection. It was my brother. For a moment, my mind couldn't process it. Here stood the man who had shared my childhood. The boy who had raced me down dirt roads, who had lifted me up when I fell, who had once sworn in the quiet of our youth that he would dedicate his life to service, to justice, to protecting people from the very kind of tyranny that now stood behind him in the form of James's ambition. But now he wasn't just my brother. He was the badge. The uniform. The embodiment of everything James had summoned to my doorstep. His expression was unreadable. Not cold, not warm, controlled. The kind of mask you learn to wear when you wear authority on your chest. But in his eyes, behind the discipline, I saw the flicker of recognition, the split second where bloodlines and duty collide. The neighbors who had been watching from behind curtains leaned in closer, their silhouettes sharper against glowing windows. To them, this was a spectacle. To me, it was something far heavier, the collision of family and law, of principle and blood. James stood at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, his smirk almost carved into stone. He had no idea who that officer was to me. No idea the history, the bond, the fire that connected us. To James, it was simple. He had called, and authority had answered. To him, this was victory in motion. But to me, the moment burned with a different kind of intensity. Because I knew my brother. I knew the weight he carried every time he put on that uniform. I knew the struggle of balancing duty with morality, of holding power in one hand while remembering the human heart in the other. And now, that struggle had arrived on my doorstep, embodied in his presence. He stepped forward, his boots steady against the wooden boards of my porch. The night air seemed to grow colder as he drew closer. I could hear the faint crackle of the radio on his shoulder, the low murmur of another officer shifting behind him, the sound of James clearing his throat like a man ready to witness triumph. "Sir," my brother said, his voice firm, official. It wasn't the voice of my childhood. It wasn't the laughter I remembered or the whispers of dreams we once shared under star-filled skies. This was the voice of law, neutral, sharp, weighted with command, but beneath that voice, I could feel something else. A tension, a hesitation, the faintest crack in the armor of authority, because while he addressed me as sir, I could see in his eyes that he was remembering something James could never understand. He was remembering blood, loyalty, and the countless moments that had bound us together long before badges or boards or rules ever entered the picture. James took a step closer, emboldened by the uniform at my door. He began to speak, his words cutting through the stillness like a knife to accusations, demands, the rehearsed language of a man certain that the law would bend to his will. His voice rose, sharp, almost celebratory. He believed he had won, but my brother didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked on mine, unwavering. And in that moment, I felt the entire weight of the neighborhood pressing in around us. Every window, every unseen pair of eyes, every heart beating faster as they waited to see what would happen when duty met family, when justice met manipulation, when the badge in the family was forced to choose between silence and truth. The air was so still it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten, his hand hovering near the notebook, clipped at his side, the faint twitch of his fingers betraying the storm raging beneath his composure. Was he here as an officer or as my brother? The question hung heavier than the night itself, unspoken yet undeniable. And as the silence stretched, as James's voice pressed louder into the air, as the neighborhood leaned closer to the edge of its own fear, I knew this was not just a confrontation. This was the beginning of a reckoning neither James, nor the HOA, nor even my brother could contain. There are collisions in life that can be heard long before they are seen. You can feel them in the air, a pressure building, a silence too heavy to last. And on that night, standing on my porch beneath the watchful eyes of an entire neighborhood, I felt that collision rising. Justice was about to meet arrogance. James stood tall at the edge of my yard, his arms folded as though the weight of the world rested comfortably on his shoulders. He had been waiting for this moment. The day he could stand with the law at his side, the day he could prove to everyone that defiance was futile, that no one escaped the grip of his authority. His smirk wasn't just for me. It was for every neighbor peeking through their blinds, every family watching from behind dimly lit windows. He wanted them to see, to understand, to fear. But arrogance has a sound. It's loud, it's sharp, it fills the air with bravado, and yet beneath it, there's always a crack, a hollow echo that betrays its fragility. James spoke as though he owned the ground beneath us, his voice rising with each accusation. He spoke of contracts, of covenants, of rules that were not suggestions. He painted himself as the guardian of order, the protector of the community. But what he really craved was submission. My brother stood in uniform, his face carved in neutrality. To James, that uniform was a shield, a weapon, proof that his reach extended beyond neighborhood bylaws. To him, my brother was nothing more than a tool, the final hammer to drive his point into the ground. But arrogance blinds, and James couldn't see the truth behind those eyes. He couldn't see the storm brewing in the silence of a man who wore justice not as power, but as responsibility. The tension on that porch was so sharp you could almost hear it crackle in the air. Every word James hurled carried the weight of authority he thought was his. But authority, real authority, doesn't roar. It doesn't smirk. It doesn't demand obedience with clenched fists. Real authority waits. It listens. It measures. And then, when it speaks, it cuts sharper than arrogance ever can. The neighborhood was a theater now. Windows flickered with faces pressed against glass, breaths fogging the panes. Some whispered to themselves, others gripped the backs of chairs, waiting for the blow to land. Because they knew James. They had lived under his rules, endured his inspections, and felt the sting of his letters. They had all been forced into silence, but now they were witnesses to something none of them had dared to imagine: James standing not above justice, but before it. As James's voice grew louder, my brother's silence became deafening. He didn't interrupt. He didn't break posture. He let arrogance pour itself out like water from a cracked vessel, knowing that eventually the flood would reveal its own emptiness. And in that silence, I saw it, the faint shift in the air, the tremor in James's tone as he realized his words weren't landing the way he expected. He wanted agreement, he wanted validation, he wanted the uniform beside me to echo his commands. But instead, all he got was silence. Silence that weighed heavier with every passing second. James stepped closer now, pointing, demanding. His arrogance no longer masked his desperation. Because deep down, even he could feel it. The tide was turning. The authority he had so confidently claimed was slipping, inch by inch, word by word, into the hands of something greater, something he could not control. My brother's gaze shifted then, just slightly, from James to me. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, not enough for James to notice, but I felt it. In that brief flicker of connection, I knew what was happening. Justice wasn't just standing silently in uniform. It was weighing, it was balancing, it was preparing. The night air was thick, every breath a reminder that the climax was coming. James still ranted, still believed he was in command, but the neighborhood could see it now. The louder he grew, the smaller he became. The more he demanded, the weaker his grip appeared. And in the stillness of my brother's silence, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't James versus me anymore. This wasn't homeowner versus board. This was arrogance standing trial before justice. And justice, though patient, never forgets to answer. The collision was no longer approaching. It was here. And everyone could feel it pressing closer with every word left hanging in the air, with every unspoken truth lingering between silence and authority, between arrogance and justice. There are moments in life when words no longer carry weight, when the voice that once dominated every conversation suddenly falls into the void of silence. And on that night, as James stood there on my porch, something happened that not only silenced him, but left the entire neighborhood breathless. It wasn't the kind of silence you find in peace. It was the silence of shock. The kind that arrives when the world shifts beneath your feet and nothing looks the same again. James had been shouting, his voice rising higher and higher, demanding recognition, demanding submission. His words cut through the air like jagged glass, but suddenly they seemed to evaporate, dissipating into nothing. What was once commanding now sounded hollow. It was as if every syllable bounced off the stillness around him and returned to mock his arrogance. The neighborhood watched from their windows, the glow of living rooms spilling onto dark lawns. Their faces were pressed to the glass, but none of them moved. Children clutched their parents' sleeves, elders leaned forward in their chairs, young couples sat frozen on their couches. They weren't watching just another HOA dispute. They were witnessing something far greater. They were watching the very balance of power tilt in a way no one had ever dared to imagine. And in the center of it all stood my brother, uniform sharp under the porch light, posture unwavering, face unreadable. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't interrupted. He hadn't flexed authority or called attention to himself. He had only stood, listening, allowing arrogance to unravel on its own. That silence was more powerful than any accusation, more commanding than any threat. It was the silence of justice weighing the scales. James, for the first time, faltered. His voice caught. His finger, once jabbing the air with confidence, trembled just slightly before pulling back. His chest rose and fell faster now, as though the weight of the night pressed harder with each breath. He looked around, as if searching for the affirmation that had always been there before. But the neighborhood was no longer nodding, no longer obeying. They were staring, they were waiting, and their silence spoke louder than his words. That was when it became clear the power James had built wasn't real. It was borrowed. Borrowed from fear, from intimidation, from the silence of others too afraid to resist. But tonight, that silence was no longer his to command. It belonged to the people. It belonged to justice. And in that transfer, he found himself exposed in a way he had never experienced before. The air itself seemed to grow heavier. Even the night creatures paused. No crickets chirped, no dogs barked, no cars passed by. The world felt suspended, balanced between the arrogance of one man and the patience of something far greater. My brother's eyes remained locked, steady, carrying the weight of a truth James couldn't escape. It was in that stillness that James finally realized, perhaps for the first time, that the law he had twisted to his favor was not his weapon to wield. The uniform standing across from him wasn't his ally. The silence wasn't his shield. And the power he thought unshakable was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, in front of the very people he had ruled over for years. The silence grew unbearable. James opened his mouth, perhaps to speak, to reclaim the ground he felt slipping away, but no words came. His lips moved, his breath caught, his arrogance collapsed into hesitation. It was a sight so unfamiliar, so unthinkable, that the neighborhood collectively froze. Was this truly happening? Was the man who had once dictated every detail of their lives now standing powerless before their eyes? You could see it in the faces at the windows. Disbelief mixed with awe. Some covered their mouths, some widened their eyes, some whispered to each other in hushed tones. This was not just James's silence. This was the silence of shock that rippled through every household, every heart, every witness who had endured his rule. James glanced back at the uniform, desperate for a lifeline, for some sign of alliance. But what he saw instead was unyielding calm, a quiet strength that no amount of shouting could dismantle. And in that look, James's arrogance cracked. For the first time, the mask slipped, and behind it was something he had spent years hiding. Fear. The silence stretched further, a vast emptiness filled with unspoken questions, unvoiced thoughts, and the undeniable sense that something irreversible was unfolding. The man who once roared over the neighborhood now stood cornered by his own echo, trapped not by chains, but by the quiet judgment of eyes that had once bowed before him. And as the night deepened, as the silence pressed harder, one truth became undeniable: arrogance had lost its voice, and justice was about to speak in a way no one could ever forget. Change has never come from the comfortable. It has never been born in the quiet halls of power, nor written into existence by those who already held the crown. Change has always come from ordinary people. People who rise from the dust of struggle, who carry scars that nobody applauds, who face battles that few ever see. And that night, in the glow of porch lights and the hush of a watching neighborhood, ordinary people discovered the extraordinary strength they had always carried within them. For years, James thrived because people stayed silent. He thrived because doors stayed closed, curtains stayed drawn, and fear whispered louder than courage. But silence has a limit, and when it reaches the breaking point, something shifts inside the human spirit. It awakens. It breathes fire. It demands to be heard. That night, in the space between arrogance and justice, the people began to remember who they truly were. You could feel it. Not in words, not in shouts, but in the way neighbors looked at one another. A glance from one living room window to the next, a nod exchanged between two strangers who had never before dared to stand together. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for years, and suddenly, a single moment gave them permission to exhale. And with that breath came clarity. They had always been more powerful than they were told. A mother who had once been fined for the color of her garden fence felt her shoulders straighten as she watched. A veteran, quiet and unassuming, who had paid dues in silence for decades, clenched his fist with a sense of recognition. A young couple told too many times to follow the rules or leave, realized they had been living under a shadow that was never theirs to bear. Each of them, in their own quiet way, began to feel the stirrings of something unstoppable. Extraordinary strength doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't march in parades or shout from podiums. It grows quietly, like roots beneath the earth, until the day comes when it cracks through the surface and shatters stone. That night was such a moment. And the stone it shattered was not just James's authority, but the illusion that people were powerless without his approval. I saw it in their eyes. In the reflection of porch lights, in the widening gaze of children who clung to their parents yet leaned forward to see more. They were witnessing something that would become a memory etched into the fabric of their lives. The moment ordinary people stopped seeing themselves as subjects and started realizing they were, in truth, the architects of their own future. James, in all his fury, had never understood this. He believed power flowed from control, from fines and threats, from the fear of punishment. But true power has always belonged to the people, the ones who work tirelessly, who raise families, who mend fences and pay bills and water lawns in the early hours of morning. Ordinary lives carry extraordinary resilience, and that resilience can topple any throne built on arrogance. The silence of shock that gripped the street did not stay empty for long. It began to shift, to take shape, to transform into the invisible bond of unity. Neighbors who once nodded stiffly across driveways now felt a kinship, a shared recognition of the weight they had all carried, and the strength they had just discovered in themselves. There is something unstoppable about ordinary people once they see their strength. History itself is proof of this truth. Empires crumble when the people rise. Tyrants fall when voices unite. Walls collapse when hands come together to push, and though no one on that street spoke a word that night, their silence was louder than any protest chant, more unshakable than any decree James had ever written. The beauty of it was how unexpected it felt. No one had walked out of their homes planning to witness a shift in power. They were ordinary families ending an ordinary day. And yet, through unfolding of that single moment, they became part of something extraordinary, something greater than themselves, something that whispered in every heart, "You are stronger than you believe, and together you are unstoppable." James didn't see it at first. He was too caught in his own unraveling, too desperate to reclaim the ground slipping beneath him. But the people saw. They felt it coursing through their veins, igniting a fire long buried. And once awakened, that kind of strength does not return to sleep. The neighborhood stood on the edge of transformation, and though the world outside might not yet know it, within those quiet streets, ordinary men and women had discovered a truth that would ripple beyond fences and sidewalks, beyond rules and signatures. They had found themselves again, and with it, the extraordinary power to change everything that came next. Every neighborhood wears a mask. At first glance, the streets seem calm, the houses neatly aligned, the lawns trimmed with care, the fences standing proud. From the outside, it all looks ordinary. Peaceful, safe, a place where families thrive. But behind every window, behind every closed door, there are battles being fought that no one ever sees. We walk past our neighbors every day, nod politely, exchange a quick smile, and never realize the weight they're carrying. Behind the fresh coat of paint on a home might be a family drowning in debt, struggling to keep up with the endless fees, and fines that strip dignity piece by piece. Behind the perfectly cut hedges might be a man working 2 jobs, exhausted, not out of pride, but because he cannot afford to fall behind. Behind the laughter of children playing in the driveway might be parents who stay awake long into the night, arguing quietly about whether they can keep living under the thumb of rules that punish instead of protect. This is the reality, so few acknowledge. Every neighborhood holds secrets of quiet suffering. And in HOA-controlled communities, those struggles often find themselves magnified, twisted by the constant pressure to conform, to obey, to meet the standards set not by compassion, but by control. James thrived in this environment because it allowed him to weaponize people's silence. He understood that most families would rather endure quietly than risk confrontation. He knew that the battles fought inside homes rarely spilled into the streets. And so he tightened his grip, knowing no one wanted to be the one to draw attention to themselves. But here is the truth no one can escape: hidden battles eventually surface. They cannot remain buried forever. The pressure builds day by day until it forces its way into the open, whether we are ready for it or not. You could see traces of it long before that night. A woman, fined for the flowers she planted in her front yard, quietly replaced them with sterile shrubs. Yet every time she walked past them, her shoulders sagged, as if mourning something no one else could see. A veteran, once proud of his service, stood helpless as James demanded he repaint his garage door 3 times in 1 year. Each time a slightly different shade, each time another blow to his pride. And then there were the countless families who lived in fear of letters in their mailboxes, knowing that even the smallest misstep, a misplaced trash can, a holiday decoration taken down too late, could unleash a storm of penalties. These weren't just inconveniences. They were emotional battles, mental wars that chipped away at people's sense of belonging, their dignity, their humanity. They made people question whether their home, the place that was supposed to be their sanctuary, was truly theirs at all. What most fail to see is how these hidden battles connect us. Every person thinks they're fighting alone. They believe their struggle is isolated, unique, insignificant. But when you look closely, you realize these individual battles are threads in the same fabric. And when the fabric begins to tear, the entire community feels the strain. James never noticed it. He was too consumed with authority, too blinded by the illusion of control. But the people noticed. Even in their silence, even in their fear, they felt the weight of one another's pain. It lingered in the way neighbors avoided eye contact, in the way laughter faded quickly, in the way children hesitated before playing too close to the street. A community was suffocating under rules meant to break, not to build. The night everything began to shift was not just about my choice to walk away or James's choice to call the cops. It was about every hidden battle rising, unseen voices pressing against the surface, demanding air. It was about the mother who had cried quietly after yet another fine. It was about the father who had swallowed his anger to keep peace for his family. It was about every silent neighbor whose strength had been tested but not yet broken. Because here's what makes hidden battles so dangerous: you never know when they will erupt. You never know when the quiet pain that has been buried for years will ignite into something unstoppable. And once that happens, the mask of perfection that a neighborhood wears begins to crack, revealing the raw truth beneath it. A truth no HOA president, no rule, no threat can ever fully contain. There comes a moment in every person's life when silence is no longer an option. You can endure the small cuts, you can swallow the indignities, you can convince yourself that keeping your head down is the easiest path forward. But deep down, there's a limit, a breaking point. And when that moment arrives, something awakens inside you. A fire, a voice, a truth that cannot be silenced. That is the power of standing tall. It doesn't always begin with grand gestures. Sometimes it starts in the smallest way: a neighbor refusing to move her flower pots after being fined. A father saying no to repainting a garage door for the 4th time. A mother deciding she will not apologize for her children's laughter echoing down the street. These are not acts of rebellion in the usual sense. They are acts of dignity. Quiet, powerful statements that say, I belong here. This is my home. And I will not be broken. Standing tall means refusing to bend under the weight of someone else's control. It means choosing self-respect over fear. It means realizing that every rule, every threat, every attempt to diminish you only has power if you let it. James never understood that. He believed compliance was endless, that the community would always bow its head. He mistook patience for weakness, silence for surrender, but he never saw the shift coming. The moment when people's spines would straighten, when voices would rise, when the quiet battles hidden in every home would unite into something far stronger than his authority. I remember the look in my neighbor's eyes the day she refused to hide her plants. For weeks she had lived in fear, trimming them back, apologizing for their color, as if beauty itself had become a violation. But that morning, she left them in place. And when James walked by, clipboard in hand, ready to deliver another warning, she didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him, calm and steady, as if to say, no more. It was not defiance born of anger, but of peace. A peace rooted in the certainty that she had nothing left to prove. That is the essence of standing tall. It doesn't require shouting. It doesn't require violence. It doesn't even require revenge. It requires presence. It requires belief. It requires the courage to occupy space without apology, to meet the eyes of those who would try to diminish you and let them see that you will not yield. James could issue fines. He could write letters. He could call meetings. But what he could not control was the strength rising within people. The more he pushed, the more they began to discover what they had forgotten, their own worth. And once a person remembers their worth, you cannot take it from them. You cannot bend them back down into submission. You cannot silence what has already been awakened. The power of standing tall is contagious. One act of courage inspires another. A single refusal to bow sparks others to rise. Soon, what was once hidden begins to spread. A family no longer pays a fine. A veteran paints his garage door the color he chooses. Children run freely again, laughter unashamed. And with each act, the chains that held the neighborhood in place begin to weaken. But James didn't see it that way. To him, every act of resistance was a personal attack, a threat to the authority he had built his identity on. He believed control was slipping, and he was desperate to regain it. That desperation grew in silence, festering, hardening, until he reached for a weapon he thought would end it all. He thought he could make one final move that would shatter the spirit rising around him. But what he failed to realize is this: once people have stood tall, they cannot return to being small. Once they have tasted freedom, they will never again accept chains. Standing tall does not just change how others see you. It changes how you see yourself. It rewrites the story you carry inside, the story that tells you whether you're powerless or powerful, whether you're a victim or a victor. And in that story, the one James thought he could erase, there was a chapter being written that he could not control, a moment building that would leave him standing face with a truth he had spent years trying to bury, a truth that was about to reveal itself in a way no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. Fear is the oldest weapon in human history. It whispers in our ears that we are small, that we are fragile, that we cannot stand against the tide. It tells us to stay silent, to stay hidden, to stay obedient. Fear thrives in the dark corners of our lives, where doubt grows like weeds, choking out our confidence and our courage. For so long, fear had its grip on this neighborhood, and for so long, James relied on it, nurtured it, wielded it like a hammer. But here's the truth about fear: it only has power until hope shows up. Because hope does not shout, it does not storm through the door. It arrives quietly, like the sunrise after the longest night. At first, you barely notice it. A neighbor smiles despite the warning letter taped to her door. A father teaches his child to ride a bike, even though the HOA rulebook tried to make the street feel like forbidden ground. A veteran raises his flag proudly, refusing to lower it because someone decided it didn't fit the aesthetic. These are small things, almost invisible in the moment, but together they are sparks. And sparks, when gathered, ignite into something far greater than fear. Hope has a way of reminding us of who we really are. It says, you belong here. You are not alone. You are stronger than you think. And when enough people hear that message, they begin to move differently. Their shoulders are square. Their voices are steady. Their steps grow more confident. Suddenly, the threats lose their sharpness. the warnings become background noise. The fear that once ruled their lives begins to dissolve into something unrecognizable. James didn't understand the nature of hope. He thought that by tightening the leash, by issuing fines, by calling the police, he could make fear grow stronger. He thought intimidation was endless, but he forgot the law of human spirit. You can only be bent so far before you decide to stand unbreakable. Fear may control for a moment, but hope transforms for a lifetime. I remember one evening vividly. The sun was setting, painting the sky in orange and purple, and neighbors who had once lived behind drawn blinds began gathering outside. They weren't there to protest. They weren't there to fight. They were simply there, together. Talking, laughing, reclaiming something James never wanted them to realize. They had unity. And as I stood among them, I felt it in my chest. That quiet but unshakable truth. Fear was no longer the air we breathed. Hope had taken its place. What makes hope powerful isn't that it erases hardship. It doesn't erase James or his threats or the rules that had been used to suffocate. What it does is shift the balance. It makes the impossible feel possible. It tells the single mother she can push back. It tells the retired soldier he doesn't have to bow. It tells the children their laughter is not a crime, but a gift. And once people believe that, fear becomes irrelevant. But hope doesn't just spread, it multiplies. It multiplies in ways you can't predict, in ways you can't contain. One person standing tall inspires another. One act of courage sparks 10 more. And soon, the fear that once seemed untouchable is nothing more than a shadow, chased away by a light it cannot survive. James saw this happening. He saw the neighbors gathering, the voices rising, the spirit shifting. And it terrified him, because for a man like James, control was everything. Authority was his shield, his identity, his comfort. Watching it slip through his fingers wasn't just a loss of power. It was a collapse of the world he had built for himself. So he doubled down. He searched for new ways to remind us of fear, new tactics to force us back into silence. But what James didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, is that once hope has taken root, it cannot be uprooted. Once people see their own strength reflected back in one another, there is no turning back. Fear may still lurk, but it can no longer lead. And that is when everything began to shift. That is when the story moved from whispers to voices, from shadows to light. That is when James began to feel the ground beneath him change, the walls around him close in, and the realization that the very thing he depended on, fear, had finally met its end at the hands of something he never expected. Life has a strange way of turning our adversaries into our greatest teachers. Sometimes, the very people who try to break us end up giving us the wisdom we never knew we needed. And James, with all his arrogance, his iron grip on the HOA, and his obsession with control, became exactly that. James thought he was untouchable. He thought the rulebook was his sword, the HOA his fortress, and feared his army. For years, he wielded them with absolute certainty, convinced that neighbors would always bow, always obey, always shrink into silence. He saw himself not as a neighbor, but as a ruler. And yet, in his hunger for power, James overlooked one simple truth: the human spirit cannot be caged forever. The lesson he taught us began not with victory but with suffering. We watched families fined for leaving a tricycle on the porch. We saw veterans told to remove their flags because they didn't fit the aesthetic. We felt the sting of letters, threats, and knocks on doors in the dead of night. Every action James took seemed designed to remind us that he was in charge. And for a time, it worked. Fear spread like wildfire. People whispered instead of spoke. Curtains stayed drawn. Laughter became rare. It was as if the neighborhood itself had forgotten what it meant to breathe freely. But here is where James became his own undoing. By pressing so hard, by demanding so much obedience, he unintentionally revealed the cracks in his own power. His cruelty was not strength, it was desperation. His authority was not respect, it was fear. And once people saw that, the seeds of change were planted. Neighbors began to look at one another differently. The man across the street who had once been just a passing wave suddenly became an ally. The woman next door, who had always kept to herself, became a voice of encouragement. Quietly, in small ways, people began to resist. A flag was raised again, a child's laughter echoing late into the evening. A smile exchanged where fear once lived. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of reclaiming. And James, without realizing it, had forced us into discovering something far more powerful than his authority: unity. The lesson James never expected to teach us was that freedom is not granted by rules or revoked by threats. It lives in the choices we make when someone tries to take it from us. It thrives in the resilience of ordinary people refusing to bend. James thought he was teaching us compliance, but in reality, he was teaching us the cost of silence. He thought he was enforcing discipline, but in reality, he was showing us the danger of unchecked power. He thought he was instilling fear, but in reality, he was fueling courage. And courage, once awakened, does not go back to sleep. What James gave us was clarity. He showed us the difference between living under control and living with dignity. He revealed the line between obedience and oppression. And most importantly, he reminded us that the strength of a community is not measured by the rules it enforces, but by the bonds it protects. When my brother stood there, badge glinting in the light, James's face told the story better than words ever could. It wasn't just the shock of being confronted. It wasn't just the humiliation of being held accountable. It was the dawning realization that the very power he had abused had finally circled back on him. In that moment, James taught us his final lesson, that those who build their empires on fear eventually crumble beneath the weight of their own actions. But the suspense is not in James's fall. The real question, the one that lingers in every heart, is what comes after. Because the lesson isn't just about him. It's about us. It's about what we do with the courage we've found, the unity we've built, the hope we've discovered. It's about whether we carry that forward or let it slip back into silence. James may have been the one to light this fire, but the choice of what to do with it now rests in the hands of those who felt its warmth. The real test isn't whether we defeated him, but whether we are ready for what comes next, when the echo of his downfall still lingers and the neighborhood stands on the edge of a future that could be brighter or darker. And so, what began as a battle over rules, fines, and authority became something far greater. It was never just about James. It was never just about an HOA. It was about us. About what we allow, what we endure, and what we choose to rise against. James thought he was teaching us obedience, but instead he awakened our courage. He thought he could fracture us, but instead he welded us together. He thought fear would silence us, but instead it gave birth to voices that would not be quiet again. Neighbors who had never spoken began to stand side by side. Families who once lived in shadows rediscovered their laughter. The streets that had grown cold with suspicion began to feel alive with unity, resilience, and hope. Out of the grip of control came a spark of freedom. And that spark is not something that fades. It is something that grows. But here lies the question that lingers like a heartbeat in the silence. What do we do now? Because James's downfall is not the end. It is the beginning of a new test. A test of whether we carry forward the unity forged in struggle or let it wither when the pressure is gone. A test of whether courage will remain our compass or whether fear will find a way to return. The story doesn't end with James. It begins with us. And the suspense, the question that no one can answer but you, is whether you will take the lesson written in his fall and carve a future stronger, freer, and braver than the past. The choice is here. The weight is real, and the world is watching to see if you will stand tall or if history will repeat itself in silence once more.